The last episode was a review of the two Mendicant Orders of monks, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. In this episode, we're going to focus on Francis and the Franciscans. It turns out Francis was not his real name. He was born in 1182 in the central Italian city of Assisi to a wealthy silk merchant named Pietro Bernardone. He was christened with the name Giovanni, but Pietro, his father, nicknamed him Francesco. As a son of privilege, Francesco spent his teens pursuing pleasure rather than studies. When a local war broke out, he did what was expected and joined the army. And it wasn't long before he was taken prisoner. When he was released at the age of 22, with the war still on, he made preparations to return to the army. But he came down with a serious illness. The diagnosis was not good. It looked that he was not long for this world. And in a way, he wasn't. You see, faced with his mortality, Francesco did what many do at a time like that. He began to think about eternal things. He rose from his sickbed, disgusted with himself for the pettiness to which his life up to that point had been devoted. He retreated to a nearby hideout, earnest in his desire to seek God. It didn't take him long to decide that he needed to visit Rome, a place that everyone at that time believed was the center of spirituality. But the Rome that assaulted Francesco's senses, it was not the Rome of his imagination. He was deeply moved by the plight of Rome's poor, who were everywhere. He wasn't able to seek God when surrounded by such misery. What especially bothered him was seeing so many desperate people huddled around the doors of ultra-opulent churches, doors through which richly clad priests and prelates sauntered. It was during the season of self-reflection that Francesco was confronted by a leper. He recoiled in horror at first, and then it occurred to him that reaction was a little different from the indifference of the church officials that he'd witnessed in Rome. They beheld immense need, but did nothing to alleviate the suffering of those that they could have helped. So Francesco turned toward the leper that he'd just shunned, kissed his hand, and left in it all the money that he had. Francesco had found in Rome something very different from what he expected. The encounter with God that he'd sought took place, but not at a gilded altar in a church. It took place in the streets among the needy. It wasn't the clean face of a priest that brought God near to him. It was the grimy face of the desperately poor. When Francesco returned home, he attended the humble chapels of surrounding villages rather than Assisi's main church. There was less pretension in the chapels. The priests who served them were more sincere. His favorite was the simply furnished St. Damian's, served by a single priest at a crude altar. It was there that Francesco became Francis, whose life and legacy would have such a huge impact on so many others. The change that came over the one-time party animal was ridiculed by those who had known him. Privileged sons like Francesco's most certainly did not grovel in the mucky world of commoners. Yet that was exactly what Francis now did. He became so attached to the so-called lower classes that his father banished him from the family home. Francis renounced his filial obligation to them in public, saying, quote, "Up to this time I have called Pietro Bernardone Father, but now I desire to serve God and to say nothing else than, Our Father which art in heaven," unquote. From then on, Francis was wholly devoted to the religious life. He dressed in beggar's clothes, moved in with a small community of lepers, washed their sores, and restored the damaged walls of the chapel of St. Damian by begging for building materials in the squares and streets of the city. He was 26 years old. Francis then received from the Benedictine abbot of Mount Sabasio the gift of a little chapel called St. Maria of the Angels, nicknamed the Little Portion. That became Francis's favorite shrine. It was there that he had most of his visions, and it was there that he eventually died. While meditating one day in 1209, Francis said that he heard the words of Jesus to his followers, quote, "Preach, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, cast out devils, provide neither silver nor gold nor brass in your purses," unquote. So throwing away his staff, his purse, his shoes, he made this the rule of his life. He preached repentance and gathered about him several companions. The rule was simple humility, poverty, and living out the new life that the gospel brings. Their mission was to preach by both word and deed. Their constant emphasis was to make sure that their lives exemplified the word, work, and ways of God. One saying attributed to Francis was, quote, "Preach at all times, and when necessary, use words," unquote. In 1210, Francis and some companions went to Rome, where they were received by Pope Innocent III. Intrigues inside the Vatican were legion at that time, their complexity just mind-boggling. But Innocent was no dunce. He was wary of anything that looked too good to be true. And Francis seemed to be just that, someone who not only preached poverty, but exemplified it. Surely, Innocent thought, there had to be some ulterior motive. And so he told Francis, quote, "Go, brother, go to the pigs, to whom you are more fit to be compared than to men, and roll with them, and to them preach the rules that you have so ably set forth," unquote. Now, whatever Innocent assumed Francis's response would be, he had to have been surprised when the report came back to the Pope that Francis had done exactly what he'd been instructed to do, and not merely as a show of obedience to ingratiate himself with power. Francis seemed to genuinely like his assignment. When we see him later communing with nature, it suggests that he did not take the assignment from the Pope as a grievous trial. Indeed, his simplicity and sincere humility probably found the pigs better company than the papal court. Pope Innocent was impressed and blessed the brotherhood, giving sanction to their unorthodox rule. They now had the right to have their hair cut in the distinctive tonsure. That's the badge of the monk. He told them to go and preach repentance. So, with papal sanction, the brotherhood grew rapidly. They called themselves the Fratres Minores, the minor brothers. Francis insisted on this as their title, as a warning to the members not to aspire to positions of distinction. All Francis allowed in the way of papal favor was recognition of his order. Everything else was declined because he knew the danger courting power inevitably brings. The members were expected to work. In his will, they were urged to visit the sick, especially lepers who sat at the very bottom of the social order. They preached in ever-expanding circles. They went abroad on missionary journeys. Francis was ready to sell the ornaments of the altar rather than refuse an appeal for aid. In fact, he was ashamed when he encountered anyone who was poorer than himself. Francis was so committed to poverty, he made a kind of covenant of marriage to it. In 1217, Francis was presented to the new Pope Honorius III. At the advice of the influential Cardinal Ugolino, he memorized his sermon. But when he appeared before the pontiff, he forgot it all and instead delivered an impromptu message which won over the entire papal court. Francis made evangelistic tours in 1219 through Italy, then into Syria and Egypt, where he tried to convert the Muslim ruler Al-Kamil that we looked at in a previous episode on the Crusades. When Francis returned from his trip, he found the order greatly changed. The aforementioned Cardinal Ugolino, he had wormed his way into oversight of the order and installed a new rule, bringing more organization and discipline. It looked less like a brotherhood and more like an order. Francis was heartbroken over the changes that the cardinal had made. Now, Ugolino knew that he was likely to be the next pope, which, in fact, he was, Gregory IX. He was determined to use the Franciscans to promote and enforce the interests of the Vatican. Early on, he'd offered Francis to help to negotiate the intricacies of Vatican life and politics. Francis accepted. Little did he realize that he was inviting a force that would fundamentally alter all that he stood for. The new rule that Ugolino installed while Francis was away in the East was a half measure, blending Francis's original liberty with Ugolino's strictness. Just 2 years later, a third rule was adopted which swept away all of Francis's original vision. Francis was just too simple, too innocent for the shrewd rulers of the church. His lack of guile couldn't compete with men whose entire lives were lived wielding vast levers of political power. Francis, the founder and inspirational heart of the order, was set aside, replaced by a religious sophisticate and elite. Francis favored freedom of movement, being able to go where and when he sensed the Spirit of God leading him. He refused the papal privileges that Cardinal Ugolino tempted him with. Francis knew that they came with strings attached. When Francis led the order, this freedom of movement marked all of the monks, but Ugolino knew that made them less dependable as a tool of the Pope, and so he moved deftly to sideline Francis. A strict monastic obedience was enforced. Organization replaced devotion. But let's be fair to the cardinal. As a creature of the Vatican, he saw the organization of the church and its ministries through a filter that was hundreds of years old. He likely thought that he was helping the clueless Francis negotiate his way around the complex web of political power in Rome. Ugolino may have thought that he was just being a friend to Francis, but his loyalty was always and only to the Pope, whom the cardinal regarded as the undisputed ruler of all and every facet of church life. It didn't seem right to him that a monastic order wasn't directly answerable to and controlled by the Pope. Ugolino did lay the foundation of the new cathedral in Assisi to Francis's honor, and it canonized him only 2 years after his death. But the cardinal could not understand Francis's humility. Priests simply could not rise in the church without a healthy dose of ambition. And wasn't rising in power the point? Didn't every priest want to be a bishop, then an archbishop, then a cardinal, and eventually the Pope? No, Francis's sole ambition was to love and serve God by loving and serving the lowest of the low, in whose face he saw the image of God. It was two very different ideas of what it means to serve God. Though Ugolino effectively hijacked the order, Francis managed to carry on in the mode that he always had, without giving any evidence that he was in rebellion. Until, that is, his will was read after his death. Then he exposed how the order had been hijacked and turned into something he never intended. Throughout the whole of the document, there runs a note of anguish over the lost simplicity that had been, the power of the first years when the presence of God had been so obvious to all, and they had the power to live the holy lives that they longed for. It was now plain for all to see that Francis's heart had been broken by the changes made to the order. Never strong, his last years were full of sicknesses. As his body failed, he jokingly referred to it as brother ass. Francis's reputation as a saint preceded his death. We've talked about relics in previous episodes, but relics were always attributed to people who'd been dead for at least decades, and more commonly hundreds of years. Francis was a living saint from whom people craved things like, the fragments of his clothing, hairs from his head, even the paring of his nails. 2 years before his death, Francis composed the hymn called the Canticle of the Sun, called by some the most perfect expression of religious feeling. It was written at a time when he was beset by temptations and with blindness that was settling into his body. The hymn is a pious peal of passionate praise for nature. He speaks of the sun and the moon, the wind, the water, fire as brothers and sisters, all called to play their part to the glory and the praise of God. The last week of his life, Francis asked for Psalm 142 to be read to him since his eyes were failing. One witness at his bedside said that when the time came, quote, he met death singing, unquote. The career of Francis of Assisi, as told by his contemporaries and as his spirit is revealed in his last testament, it leaves the impression of purity, purpose, humility of spirit, of genuine saintliness, if I may say it. He sought no positions of honor nor a place with the great. With a simple mind, he sought to serve his fellow man by announcing the gospel, living out his understanding of it in his own example. He sought to give the gospel to the common people, and they heard him gladly. He didn't possess a great intellect, but he had a great soul. Francis wasn't a theologian in the classic sense, someone who thought lofty thoughts. He was a practical theologian in that he lived the truths the best theology holds. He spoke and acted as one who was fully confident in his mission. The Mendicant Orders of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, which we'll take a look at next time, comprised a medieval poverty movement that was, in large part, a reaction to the politicizing of the faith. It was a movement of priests, monks, and eventually commoners who'd come to believe that church policies sought to wrangle political influence for ever more power in world affairs. These would-be reformers wondered, is this what Jesus and the apostles intended? Didn't Jesus say that his kingdom was not of this world? Why then are bishops, cardinals, and popes working so hard at controlling the political realm? The call to voluntary poverty drew its strength from widespread resentment of corrupt clergy. Not that all or even most priests were corrupt, but it seemed the only priests selected for advancement were those who played the church's political game. The back to the New Testament poverty movement of the mendicants became a political movement in itself, a reform movement fueled by the spiritual hunger of the common people. As early as the 10th century, reformers had called for a return to the simplicity of the early church. The life and example of the apostles was regarded as the norm, and when modern bishops were held up to that example, it was clear that something bad had happened. Bishops in their religious finery stood markedly higher than the apostles in terms of worldly power and wealth. To illustrate this, visit the cathedral at Cologne, Germany. There is a little museum there called the Treasury. If you don't find it, look for it because it's important to see. It contains several display cases with the various vestments and tools the cardinals of Cologne have worn. Composed of gold and silver threads, encrusted with gems, these robes are literally priceless. One set of display cases sums up for me the utter contradiction of an exalted clergy. They hold what are called croziers. Now, a crozier is a stylized shepherd's staff. It's carried by a bishop or a cardinal. It's a symbol of his role as a pastor, as a shepherd. As a shepherd's staff, it ought to be just a functional and useful tool, a humble piece of wood used to guide and protect sheep. But the croziers in the treasury at Cologne Cathedral are made of solid gold. Their headpieces jammed with rubies and emeralds, diamonds, pearls. You would no more use that to tend sheep than you would a painting by Rembrandt. Every time a cardinal wrapped his fingers around that crozier, he ought to have been convicted about how far from his calling as a humble servant to the flock of God that he was. Now, imagine that you're a commoner at church one Sunday. You've just been told by the priest that God wants every bit of money that you can give. In fact, he'll say God needs your money. And then in walks the cardinal with his jewel-encrusted cape, his mitre, and that priceless crozier in his hand. How long before you begin to say to yourself, what is going on here? Did Jesus wear a getup like that? Did Peter or John or any of the apostles? I don't think so. In fact, Jesus said something about not even having anywhere to lay his head. Well, but that cardinal has a nice satin-covered down pillow. In earlier centuries of the church, calls for reform were dealt with by, channeling them into internal reform movements that directed attention away from the upper hierarchy to a more personal desire for reform that ended up in increased devotion on the part of lower clergy and commoners. That's what many of the monastic orders were. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, things began to change. Many of the lesser clergy began to speak out against the abuses of the church. And when they did, they often ended up in the ranks of what were called the heretics. And because they supposedly had embraced heresy, their influence had to be blunted by the church. Francis adopted a radical devotion to poverty as a way to confront the blatant greed of the church. His example spread like wildfire precisely because it was so obvious to everyone how far off the church had gotten. And it explains why Ugolino felt obligated to bring the order back in line by bringing it under papal control. While outwardly commending their order's devotion to poverty, he installed policies that made the order dependent on their landholdings and property. It's hard to criticize the wealth of the church when you're part of that church and possess a good measure of that wealth. Well, some were wise to Ugolino's ways, and they managed to stay true to Francis's original vision and commitment to poverty. Because they refused to knuckle under to the cardinal's rule, they were declared heretics, and as such, they were treated with a brutality that no one can reconcile with the gospel of grace. But that's for a later episode.